All right, so, but is that okay if she's not using microphone? I can hold it for you.
Yeah, great.
我去。Sorry. 没关系，可以先开始。Right, so much. They can adjust.
I have to look over there.
So I will start. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wu Jialing from Department of Sociology. It's my great honor to introduce you today's speaker, Professor Celia Roberts. Professor Roberts is a professor of sociology at the Australian National University. She's a leading feminist SDS scholar globally with notable books like Messengers of Sex, published by Cambridge University Press, Puberty in Crisis, also by Cambridge, and Living Data, Making Sense of Health Biocensoring, and the co-edit companion to Actor Network Theory. Her most recent work, Making Bushfire Babies, was just published 2 months ago. We are so fortunate to have Celia here today to discuss her latest book with us. And we would like to express our gratitude to Professor Shi Liwen from Taipei Medical University and the Taiwan Social Resilience Research Center at the National Taiwan University, led by Professor Lan Peijia, for sponsoring Celia's visit and today's talk. The presentation will be around 1 hour, followed by an open discussion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Celia Roberts.
Thank you very much. It's the ghost of you, the echo. Okay. Good. Sorry about this. This is just too many things to hold in my hands. So thank you so much for coming today. It's amazing to be here. Such a wonderful trip. This is my first trip to Taiwan. And I want to thank Liwen for inviting me and Chia-Ling as well for supporting this visit, and also the Social Resilience Center as well, Peijia. It's just, I've learned so much about Taiwan over many years because I supervised 2 PhD students, Li Wen and Lin Wenyuan, who, when I was living in England. So it's a very strange thing when you're a supervisor to supervise about a country you've never been to, and you get this very specific form of knowledge. I know about kidney dialysis and prenatal screening and testing and nothing else. So it's a very strange thing. So it's just amazing. It's like coming to a dream place that you know you've heard about so much and read so much about, but you've never been. So it's just amazing to finally be here. So I said this in the talk on Tuesday, but I'll just say it again, that in Australia, when we give a talk, we do an acknowledgement of country, which is acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which the research was done or where the talk was given. So it's my responsibility to do that. So I want to acknowledge that this research took place on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and the Yuin people in Australia, who are the First Nations people where we were working in Canberra and the southeast coast of New South Wales, and acknowledged that the sovereignty of their land was never ceded. That means it was stolen by British colonisers, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And in this talk, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but it's very important in the book that we use the work of First Nations scholars to talk about fire and to think about how fire is used to take care of country. So that area of expertise is a very, very significant part of Indigenous Australian culture, and really important to recognise that. So I've got all these things. So yes, this is called Making Bushfire Babies, which is what we wanted the title of the book to be, but publishers don't like titles like that, so that's the subtitle. The book is called something else. Too cute. Oh, I just want to show you all these pictures that I'm using as on the background are pictures given to us by the participants in this research. So I'll tell you in a minute, but we interviewed people and then asked them at the end of the interview, do you have any photos you'd like to share with us of the bushfires? Nothing with people in, nothing with babies, just your home or what it was like where you were living. And of course people do, because people they're just taking photos all the time. So these photos show you, I hope, and give you a sense, bring you into Canberra, bring you into the coast, and you can see how smoky it is. This is looking down the main road towards the Australian National Parliament. Right, this is a very important road in the nation. You can't see the Parliament. Normally you can see this looming special building, you can't see it. Right, so that's the level of poor visibility we had in the country at the time. So I'm sure you're aware of these fires, but I'm going to... actually, Lee Wen and I went to the hairdresser the other day, and I forgot to put this on the slide. I was sitting, having my hair done, dried, and I looked at a magazine. It was a Marie Claire, Taiwan or something, from 2022, and we flicked through, just looking fashion. There was a whole story about the Australian bushfires and all these photos of the bushfires. And I thought, okay, so this has reached Taiwan high fashion magazines. Very strange. Maybe someone can explain that to me. So the fires I'm talking about are the 2019 to 2020 bushfires, so occurred over the summer of that. Some media stories call these the Black Summer bushfires, but we find that a rather racist term because it implies that black is a bad thing. So we're not using that term, and our Indigenous colleagues have asked people not to use that term. So you may have heard that term, but I'm not going to use it. I just call them, rather more boring, the 2019 to 2020 bushfires. So in these bushfires, 17 million hectares of Australian land was destroyed. And you can see how many times that is of Taiwan. It's a huge area of land burnt, and very severely burnt, not lightly burnt, deeply burnt, in a way in which everything dies, which is unusual. 33 people died directly in the fires, including firefighters and citizens, and then another 445 deaths were later associated, which in a way shows you how good our fire services are, because that's not very many people compared to the extent of land. So, but nonetheless, it's a loss. Over 3,000 homes and many farmlands, fencing, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of buildings were destroyed. And this is, to me, like so shocking that it's almost impossible to think how many non-human creatures died. So this is obviously estimates. 3 billion non-human animals died, including, as it says there, 143 million mammals, 2.46 billion reptiles, 180 million birds, and 51 million frogs. So the loss of life, of plant life and animal life, is just sort of huge, absolutely huge. And that is still recovering because it was so profound it can't just recover in a normal way. So the air quality, as I will tell you in a bit, was incredibly bad in many places. Obviously near fire it's incredibly bad, but the smoke was so huge that people in New Zealand could experience the smoke, right? That's a long way away from Australia. At the time in Australia, there were two sort of key discourses describing these fires, and we discussed these in the introduction to the book. The sort of business as usual, oh, Australia always has fires, this is just sort of nothing to see here, people. You know, like it's exciting, but it's worrying, but this is just business as normal. And our then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, sort of was of that ilk, more right-wing conservative Prime Minister, and he was famously on holiday in Hawaii at the time and didn't come back very quickly, which was probably a political mistake. He's no longer our Prime Minister. And famously, I don't know whether this went globally viral, but famously went to a village, which is a very dear village to me because it's near where I used to go on holidays as a child and still do go on holidays, which had the fire just completely took out a whole central line of the village. And the citizens were very distressed. And he was there, you know, trying to show that he cared after having not been there. And he grabbed the hand of a woman. He forced her to shake his hand, and she was a pregnant woman. It's very interesting. She was very angry and distressed. And he sort of grabbed her hand to shake it. She wasn't offering her hand. And this became a symbol of the lack of care of the leading party. So that's one idea. This is just business as usual. This is Australia always burns, nothing, you know. And these are people associated with not caring about climate crisis. The other side was a very strong environmentalist line to say this is evidence of climate crisis, right? And of course, in the title of my book, I'm picking up on that line. You know, this is to do with what we've done over many centuries. We want to run an argument sort of between those two lines, a slightly different line, to talk about climate crisis, but also to think about the long history of practices, human practices, that have produced Australia as a place where this kind of thing is likely to happen. So that's kind of what we're trying to talk about and what the effects of that are. So just more bushfire photos. I find it very difficult to know how many of these to show because I have a problem. I mean, the thing with bushfires is they're incredibly beautiful in a way. Like they produce these incredible scenes of light and smoke and this sort of apocalyptic vision. And, you know, climate environmentalists use these sort of things all the time to try and shock people, and I'm using this to try and show you how big it is. But, of course, the risk of that is that we turn off and we think it's too difficult, too frightening, we can't engage. So I'm trying to tread a line here between showing you a bit to get that, oh, my God, feeling, but I don't want to just make it feel like this is out of our control. I don't think this is completely out of our control. So hopefully these are showing to make you think, oh, okay, this is something we need to take seriously, but it is terrifying. So, you know, I think about this sort of, I think this is true of all sorts of texts about the Anthropocene or this idea of human impact on the climate, that it can be kind of made beautiful by really good photographers. Do we really want the end of our planet to become this aesthetically represented thing? And what does that do? Anyway, that's maybe something people have thought about. But there it is. You can also, I mean, you can see how huge this smoke was. That's why it goes, could be seen from space, right? So this is the book, as Charlie just said, which has just come out and is co-written with Mary Lou Rasmussen, who's a colleague of mine, who's an expert in queer theory, feminism, sex education. Louisa Allen, who's also a New Zealander, who's also a sex education and sort of new materialist expert. And Rebecca Williamson, who's our researcher, who's currently working with me on epigenetics project, but she did the interviews for this project, so she's a really brilliant, she's a human geographer, but she did a lot of that. The cover of the book, again, what sort of representation should you choose? Very tricky thing when you're choosing a cover for a book. But we chose this one because, in the end, because there weren't many pictures of babies, and the ones we had people didn't want us to use because they found it too upsetting to be reminded of the difficulty they'd had while they were pregnant during the fires, so they wouldn't let us use the image. But in Canberra at the time of the fires, we lived near a massive national park called Namadgi National Park. It borders the whole southern part of the city. And some army guys were doing a helicopter reconnaissance flight and they needed to go to the toilet. So they landed the helicopter in the bush to go to the toilet, and on leaving, they set fire to the bush accidentally. 80% of that park was destroyed. So whenever I see that picture of the helicopter, this is a classic human error. When the world is so dry and so ready to go, you can't make mistakes like that. And, you know, it's a great tragedy, and there's been a big investigation of why that happened. And anyway, so that's why that image is there. Oops. So these are our key questions for the book. They're quite simple questions, really. What is it like to be pregnant and or to care for a newborn baby in a climate crisis? We want to think about what is happening within reproduction. How do we bring climate crisis and reproduction into a conversation? And how do people manage during extreme fires and smoke events? So we were already thinking about these questions, and then the fires happened. So we thought, okay, this is our case study. Suddenly it's right here. What are the implications of these experiences for our, as feminists and sociologists, understandings of reproduction, kin and climate crisis? And what concepts can we use to help understand or theorise the current situation? So the book is in conversation with social scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, with STS and queer work on distributed reproduction, on population and kinship and on health. But it's really trying to emphasise the significance of climate crisis. So there's a very broad field in all of those studies. And there's a whole field of disaster studies that we don't engage with particularly. That's not my field. So, yeah, that's it. It's there, but it's not particularly there. So, I want to introduce this concept of the Pyrocene, which I'm guessing most people haven't heard of. I hadn't heard of it before I wrote this book. So, I'm just going to read a little bit from here because this is a bit more well written than me jabbering on. Oh, sorry, it's gone to sleep. So in the book, we begin an exploration of what we call the biosociality of fires, so thinking about fires as both a biological or physical phenomenon and a social phenomenon, by engaging with environmental historian Stephen Pine's notion of the Pyrocene. He's written many books about fire. So across a range of publications, Pine uses this term to highlight the significance of humans' relation to fire in the planet's current ecological predicament. The term's in many ways very similar to those more commonly used in social theory and sociology, such as the Anthropocene, which is, as you probably know, popularised by Paul Crutzen, and widely used in the geo and social sciences and humanities, and then the Capitalocene, which was popularised by geographer Jason Moore in 2017 and feminist STS scholar Donna Haraway. In each case, these terms describe our current epoch as one in which geological strata, so the land itself, and thus our entire global environment have been shaped by human activities, right? That's the point of it. The terms are used to make claims that the previous geological epoch, the Holocene, which dates from 10,000 years ago and is characterised by the retreat of glaciers, the migration of species and the rising dominance of humans, is now over. Such claims are, of course, scientifically contested. So there's a big debate, as you probably know, about when does the Anthropocene start? Did the Anthropocene start in the Industrial Revolution? Did it start on the rise of human agriculture 12,000 years ago? Or is it more recent, like the development of the atomic bomb? There's all different places where that's seen to start. And other theorists write of the Plantationocene, highlighting the historical significance of slavery and colonisation to the current situation. So Pine has a really interesting argument against these ideas of the Anthropocene, of the Capitalocene, and he says the Pyrocene does not come after the Holocene, but is a better term for the entire period. The Holocene is often seen as this really lovely time when nothing went wrong and then the Anthropocene happened. He says actually all of this whole period since the Ice Age is shaped by fire. So he says, to quote him, the Holocene is the Anthropocene. Since the last glacial epoch, warming has been continuous with minor blips, and throughout those millennia, humanity's firepower has made it more and more dominant. Today, there is no aspect of the Earth that we have not altered. So he's talking about the ways in which the world as we know it, the planet that we know, has been shaped by humans' relationship with fire for many, many decades, millennia. And he tracks that through amazing guys, one of those incredibly global kind of thinkers. He goes into detail in all parts of the planet in a way that I couldn't even begin to imagine how you would do that. And one place he does it is Australia. He's been to Australia. He works a lot with fire experts in Australia to look at First Nations use of fire, and particularly the use of what is called fire stick farming, or to use fire to farm land. it's a very complicated story, I can't go into it, but basically, white Australians like me, so I was born in the late 60s, we were taught that Indigenous people sort of roamed the earth, roamed the country, freely picking, you know, plants and maybe hunting a few animals. They didn't do anything, right? That was the racist ideology we were brought up with. There's been a whole, many generations of work since my childhood showing that actually what First Nations people were farming the country. But they didn't farm the way European people farmed. One of the key ways they farmed was through strategic use of cool fires, small fires, where you burn scrub, you burn low-lying plants. The trees have evolved so they don't get burnt in the same way, or they only get burnt in quickly and they don't burn deeply. And this clears land for hunting. It allows plants to germinate and it allows plants to grow. So Australian animals and plants have evolved, co-evolved with Indigenous Australians and fire. And Stephen Pine writes about this as one of the good side of the Pyrocene. Like, this is the Pyrocene functioning well, that people could use fire to produce food and to take care of their land. Of course, colonisation in the Australian case, but also Canada, America, all these places. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know about Taiwan. I didn't get to check whether Pine writes about Taiwan. Maybe he does, I don't know. Colonisation disturbs these regimes, brings a European relationship to fire into a country that's very different, into a different set of plants, and just suppresses or controls or takes over Indigenous fire practices and messes the whole thing up, creates this incredible mess. Then we have Industrial Revolution, we have you know, the increasing use of fossil fuels, and we just have more and more and more use of fire, but in fossil fuels, right? So we start burning the hell out of things, we raise the temperature of the planet, we burn fuel, and fire gets out of control. So the Pyrocene, as a concept, conveys this traditional, successful way of living and this out-of-control way of living. And he argues that one of the problems with the European concept of fire is we think we don't understand in the Australian context that we need more fire, not less fire. So the white Australian attitude towards managing fire is to control fire, to suppress fire. You've got to stop fires happening. You don't let people burn, right? They're starting to realise this is not a good idea. Because if you don't burn enough, things get very, very thick, lots of plants, and then when there's a drought, there was a 5-year drought before the bushfires, it's like this incredible, it's like it's prepared to go. You know, it's like you've set up an amazing fire. And Indigenous people were warning the government about this and no one was listening. So you produce this situation where the current out-of-control fires are absolutely inevitable, right? They're not a natural disaster, they're a socio-cultural, political situation. So we take this concept in the book, the Pyrocene. I have problems with it. I'm not saying it's rather universalist. It pays no attention to sex and gender. You'll be shocked and surprised to know. And it doesn't pay any attention to reproduction. But we're kind of trying to take this concept and do a spin with it, have a play with it, and take it into feminist STS and feminist sociology and think what it does for us. So you can tell us whether it's successful or not sure. Okay, so what do we do? So what we did was to talk to people. So the fires ended, COVID started. So we were already in a lockdown several months before anyone else, right? Because we were in the fire lockdown. Very difficult time to do research. What we wanted to do was walk with people in their environments. We wanted them to take us on a walk, to look at what had happened with the fires, where they'd been, how they'd managed. Couldn't do it, couldn't go out. So we ended up doing interviews mostly, and sometimes had to be on Zoom. We're talking with people with newborn babies. It's quite difficult to do Zoom interviews with people in lockdown with newborn babies. So Rebecca did her best. She did a brilliant job, but it was tricky research. Occasionally, if the lockdown had paused, she could go and meet them outside, but often it was just face-to-face. So we talked with people for as long as they could talk to us. Sometimes their husbands or partners, but mostly just the women were available. And And we also, as I said, asked them to give us photographs. We also asked them to do drawings, and this was inspired by Li Wen's PhD work. We asked them to draw who they expected to help them before the fires, when they were pregnant, having a baby, and then who or what actually helped them. And they were quite different things, because COVID and the fires, it ends up being a study of COVID as well, because COVID was immediately following it. We were part of a wider, and we continue to be part of a wider biomedical study about the impacts of smoke on fetuses and babies. So we recruited some of our sample through them, but also just through chatting to people and getting to know who they are. One of the big limitations of this study is that we could only recruit a sort of thin slice at the top of society, so to speak. So these are educated, mostly white, mostly heterosexual, middle-class women. We tried pretty hard to find other people. People were pretty stressed at that time, so people were not willing to talk to researchers about this stuff at that time. We just couldn't do it. We couldn't get anyone to talk to us. So that's just how it is. We also did other work interviewing experts and did textual analysis, but I'm going to talk mostly about interviewees here. So as I said before, these are people living in Canberra, which is the capital city of Australia, a very small city surrounded by bush. Right? We are the bush capital. Absolute bush is not a city like this. It's full of trees and mountains and plants right in the city. There's not that distinction between the city and the bush. So in 2003, there was a major fire in the city, right? And hundreds of homes burnt. So it doesn't have the same distinction that you might have in Taiwan. Or they were living on the south coast, which was a very terrible place for fires, and that's really very small, like villages, really. There's no cities at all. So they're living a very rural life. So just show a couple of photos so you get a bit of a sense of it. So again, that's looking up to this American eagle that was donated by the American government many years ago, which hovers slightly menacingly across Australia's capital. Anyway, you can't hardly see it. There's a big mountain behind there, you can't see it. That's looking at someone's house. So get these incredible colours in bushfire sunsets. I mean, it really does do something amazing with the light. But you can see it's just really hard to see anything. And that's someone living in the countryside, like that's sort of 700 metres from her house. Like she's looking out of that and she's pregnant, she's got a little kid. She's got to get out of there pretty quick. So these are, again, very beautiful photos, but pretty tough. That's an image of out of a car, and we have a little bit of video footage. And I'm going to tell this story in a little bit, but this is taken by a woman who was forced to evacuate. So once the fire comes, you're told you have to leave. You're given a choice. You can stay and defend your house, or you can leave. Guess which gender of people tend to stay? Men stay, women go, right? That's a really clear thing. People only ever stay once. It's horrendous to stay. Staying to try and stop your home burning down is like one of the most frightening experiences of anyone's life. So this is a scene from a woman driving with her husband with a newborn baby, looking out the window. I mean, you can see it's obviously already burnt there, but driving through burnt land to try and get to safety. I mean, it's really a very frightening experience. And these are the kind of drawings people did. I mean, again, they're doing it with a baby on their lap, or they're doing it, so they're not very sophisticated drawings, but they're maps of what was more significant. So, you know, things that became more significant than they thought, or less, or whatever. So just rough ideas. This one you can see us. Us is like her and her husband and the baby. And see on the right, I don't know, I can point with this. I don't know how to do that. Top one? Oh, yeah. See, it says purifier. I'm going to come back to that. That's the air purifier. So the paper, I'm going to focus mostly on Canberra and coping with extreme smoke. That's the hospital in Canberra. You can't really see it. That's where people were supposed to be going to give birth. The clinicians said there was literally smoke billowing down the corridors. Like, so you go in to have a baby and there's like smoke. It was one of the smokiest places in the city because it's quite an old building, poor ventilation. So worst air quality in the world. This is in January 2020. So we had 23 times the hazardous level of particulate matter, 23 times that. Worst air quality in the world. This is a city that normally has beautiful, clean mountain air. So it was a real shock to people. It's not like they live in a polluted city. They live in an unpolluted city. So they're like, this can't be like this. And there's some quite... People go, oh, we expect that in India, but we don't expect it here. You know, there was that kind of, this can't be happening to us, which I think is quite an interesting sign of the privilege of these people. And there's very little scientific or biomedical work on what are the effects of bushfire smoke on babies. There's very little research on this. There's more research on car pollution or air pollution, but very little. So this study that we're involved in will be one of the first studies to actually try and track that. So we've got 1,000 mother and baby pairs, babies born during that time, and they're going to track them over 5 years to see what actually happens to babies. But no one knows. So at the time, no one knew. So what the hell were you supposed to do? There's all this smoke coming. So our colleagues at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Research at ANU, my university, decided they should put out some information. And they put out that information, which has, as you can see, the big plume of smoke that I showed you at the beginning. And can you see the pregnant woman? There is a pregnant woman. She's quite small. Yeah, down the bottom. She's there with a baby, and a pregnant woman, an old woman, and a cat, which I find very interesting because it's kind of like all the vulnerable people and things are down there, you know, and she's there with vulnerability and help others. So she's someone that needs to be helped, right? She gets produced as more vulnerable than other people, like an older person. Everyone else looks like they're a man. But they're just the figures, aren't they? So this was designed in January 2020 to try and fill this void of information, what we're supposed to do. It was translated into 11 languages. There was a lot of criticism that information wasn't available in different languages, so they did a great job on that. And this tells you, you know, as I said, implies that there's sort of vulnerability. The women in our study were, as I said, highly educated, quite, they were women who were pregnant by design. They wanted to be pregnant. They'd thought about it. They'd looked after their preconception health. They had eaten well. They'd avoided alcohol. They weren't smokers. So they were really keen to know what to do. They recognised themselves in this, and they did everything they were supposed to do. They wanted to know what to do, and they were willing to do it. So they were kind of model citizens. They were, you know, obliging, responsive, concerned, caring, and they tried to act properly. This leaflet in the other pages of it tells you to stay indoors, to reduce your physical activity. You weren't supposed to go out running or swimming or walking. And they tried to protect both their mental and physical health. Some of them wore masks. The government actually gave out masks to pregnant women. This is, I mean, in your culture, masks are much... we didn't wear masks before COVID, right? Like, no, the only people that wore masks were visiting Asian people. So people didn't wear them. Like, they were given them, and they were even told by midwives and others, oh, don't wear that, that's not a good idea. Like, it's hard to remember pre-COVID masks, but they were, people thought, it would be frightening to my children, I can't possibly put a mask on. They just wouldn't wear them. And they got prepared. You have to, in Australia, always have a fire plan so you can know where to evacuate and how to get out. So, you know, they did all those things. But what you're also supposed to do, what number is it? Number 9, you're supposed to follow air quality information. How? Like, that's what I got interested in. How were they doing that, and what did they actually do? Because it's a pretty unusual thing to be asked to do, right? Follow air quality information. You can follow advice, but how do you follow information? Kind of strange. So one thing that a lot of people did, which makes sense to me, is that you go and talk to your doctor or your midwife about it. So this is Renee, one of our interviewees. She said, well, I spoke to my midwife about it, just mentioned, like, what should I do? And their advice was, just take it easy and try and stay out of the smoke. They were very upfront. Like, the only advice they could give was to stay out of it. But they also said, like, babies are really resilient, and if, oh, there we go. And if anything, the mother will be affected before the baby will. So they tried to be very reassuring, but they also, you know, and she sort of trails off. You could sense they needed to be careful because there's no medical rules and not a lot of medical research. I don't know, like, if there is any, but certainly they weren't speaking from a basis of, like, this has happened before and this was proven. It was just more like, try and stay out of it. And the baby, you know, you've got to look after you. The baby will look after itself, hopefully. So a lot of people found that kind of worrying advice. It's like, what, just stay out of it? I mean, stay out of it. How do you stay out of it? And what, is the baby really going to be able to look after itself? What does the placenta do? Does the placenta filter smoke? How do they, we asked people, how do you think the baby breathes? People didn't understand, they had never thought about that. How does the baby get air? How might this air get to the baby? They had no idea. And people weren't, because it's not part of a normal protocol, no one told them. They didn't understand how to find that information. So they were left to make up stuff. So they made up stuff. They wanted to do things, and so they did things, they made things up to do. So I'm calling this is a sort of nod to STS. Those of you know the tinkering word, it's a very well-known word in STS scholarship, that technologies don't just come with certain ways of behaving. What people actually do is play with them, and they make them fit themselves, right? So there's a whole range of scholarship around tinkering. So they tinkered with their homes. They tinkered with the stuff they had available in their house, because they weren't supposed to go out. So they tinkered with wet towels. They wet towels and they lined them along the bottom of the door to try and stop the smoke coming into their house. They put tape, plastic, like thick tape, masking tape, we call it, or you call it here, all around the windows. They got up on ladders. Women were saying to me, I know I shouldn't be doing it because I was really pregnant, but I wanted to get the air vents, you know, and they closed off the air vents. A lot of people in Canberra have a form of cooling called evaporative cooling, which sucks, it's not like air conditioning, it sucks in outside air and puts it through water. It's beautiful. It brings in smoke. So they had to close off all cooling. It was over 40 degrees every day. Stinking hot, as we say in Australia. Boiling hot. You've got to close the house off, and you can't have any air coming in. And you're pregnant. Not much fun. And some of them had little kids as well. It was a very tricky time. So they did all these things, and I was just reading Charlene's work, and I thought, this is a really sort of strange form of anticipatory labour, isn't it, right? You're anticipating not only your baby, as your women are doing, but you're anticipating the fire, the smoke coming in. What are the unknown effects of that, right? So I think it's a very interesting, I think in your concept it's like about what you do on yourself, but this is like what you do in your world to try and make your world. It takes the womb out to the house, at least to the house. Often they could only produce one room that was okay. Australian houses are quite large and they're sort of sprawling. So you might make one room in your house airtight as you could, and get all your kids in there. So the kids would sleep in there, the mum would sleep in there, trying to make one space, sort of one step out from the womb, right? Or one step out from her body to try and make this a clean space. So thank goodness for Dyson. Because Dyson makes these things, as you probably know, and we saw one in the shops yesterday, the day before. These are air purifiers. These things became like gold, right? These were the thing that every middle-class person suddenly needed, having never had one before. These aren't the kind of things people ever had before. Well, obviously they had them because someone... But in Australia, living in Canberra, it's beautiful, clean air. You don't need one of these. Now you need one of these. So they were about $1,000, so that's 20,000 Taiwan dollars. So they're not cheap. And people did everything they could to try and get one of these, getting them sent from overseas, getting their husbands to drive huge distances to get them, you know, like really desperate. Because this was the only technology that made any difference besides taping your house up. So Matilda, one of our respondents, she got sent one. And she says here, no, it did something. It was a sweet, it had a sweetness. I needed sweetness. She was very ill with pregnancy illness. And she said it was so nice. She said it was just respite. I guess it provided respite, having a room with slightly better air, this idea that this one safer room. She says it didn't solve the air problem at all, but it did make a little bit of difference, a very small one. It was very reassuring, very sweet, this idea of emotional kind of concern. And then Rebecca asked another woman, Gina, did it help a lot? She said, I think it did. It was good because it kind of like shows you, it had different LED lights and stuff on it. So when the air quality was really bad, it would go red, and you could hear it like revving up sort of thing. I've never actually used one, so I don't know what they sound like. So it was just more of a peace of mind sort of thing. Like I could hear it, I could see it. I knew it was doing something. Something at that point was better than nothing. I think this is a very common experience with technology, isn't it? It's like, we don't even know whether that's working, but it's making a noise and going bing. You know, it's beeping. It's like Monty Python. And that really helps people. You feel like you're doing something because you have to do something. And the machine gives you some sort of sense. It makes a noise. So in the care maps, things that you thought were going to happen, you're going to have your friends over, you're going to have your mum, you're going to go to baby group, all those things couldn't happen because of COVID and the fires. But there's your Dyson. Your Dyson gets listed on here as a thing that made it possible to get through. And that happened over and over again. The air purifier, the Dyson, comes up as... So we sort of half-jokingly say they become kin, right? We're kinning with these machines because they make our kin world doable. So people started looking at data. These machines give you data on quality, and they got really interested in air quality. Never thought about air quality before. Suddenly they become interested in air quality. But they're also using their bodies. So there's this very interesting way in which they both use their bodies and the machines to sort of, I guess in social science we'd say they triangulate. They triangulated their data. What can I see? Can I see the mountain from here or not? You normally can see the mountain, so I can't see the mountain. The smoke's bad right now. What does it smell like? Does it smell really bad today or not so bad? The scientists don't like this because they say particulate matter, the worst one you can't smell, but humans believe if we smell, we know. And I think that's really important. Am I coughing more? Does my throat hurt more? Is it hurting my nose? And they would also look at these machines and look at the data. The government was also providing some data, of course, so they were looking at that data as well. So Sarah describes this. She says, there were some days when it was just like disgusting. And then, yeah, like I was saying, a couple of days we were like, I can actually see blue sky. And as you know, monitoring the numbers of, I can't remember what the measurement was now. So this is talking to 6 months later. It was like measuring the smoke particles in the air. And we all became weird experts on what was like an appropriate amount of air pollution. And if it was under a certain amount, then I'd go like, okay, be like, that's it. That means I can go to the pool today, or I can sit in the backyard. So that's such an Australian thing, is like, go to the pool today. But you're supposed to exercise when you're pregnant, right? Sitting around is not a good idea. So people with all sorts of conditions needed to still exercise. A lot of them had little kids who were going crazy in the house because it was boiling hot and they wanted to cool off. So they had to be constantly deciding, okay, right, looks a bit better now, we'll go out for half an hour. Or we'll go to the pool, or we'll go let the children go on the trampoline, or whatever it is they're going to do. So they had to work out what to do and how to behave. And as I say, they're sort of using their bodies as sensing technologies, but also using these technologies. And there's a really interesting sort of blurring between the technological information and the bodily sensory information that I think says a lot about how biosensors work in general, but that's another topic. So as I said, the government was producing data, but they only had 3 places in the whole city where they were collecting data. And they were producing a 24-hour rolling average, which everyone told me about, which is pretty useless because that's what happened yesterday, right? And it's what happens, a sort of average over the whole city. So your backyard's different to my backyard. If you live on the mountain or down here, really different. And guess what? The poorer parts of the city have worse smoke. So we could really see that certain parts of the city collect smoke in a way that other parts don't. It's sort of weirdly unintentional. So there wasn't enough information, and people felt like they really didn't know. They couldn't get enough information. And almost everyone told us about this guy and this project. There's a man called Shalev Nesaiya, who's a data scientist who lives in Canberra and whose wife was pregnant at the time. He was extremely worried about air quality. Some people get really worried about this, other people don't. He was one of the ones who gets really worried. So he decided, right, I'm going to find out I'm going to sort this in a classic data management kind of way. I mean, thank goodness for him. And as she says here, she said, yeah, there's this guy, some guy on, and she's saying to the interviewer, do you want to know who it was? Yeah, that'd be great. I'll see if I still follow him. Canberra Air, who was just some local dude who gathered up the data and put it out in this nice, helpful way. Because she's saying sometimes it was like 10 hours ago data, that's not what I need. I'm trying to remember how he presented the data though. I can't remember, the pictures aren't showing up. But yeah, I would just usually check that. My dad would be checking something else and I'd be sort of like, no, mine says this. So you start to argue the official data versus the citizen data, but people all love this guy. So what he did, and I think this is going to happen more and more in climate crisis, right? He was collecting data from citizens who were collecting data, right? So you could buy these, they're called purple air monitors. People were buying them because all the sort of people interested in data were getting interested in it, collecting data in their backyards and posting it. And he was gathering, he had the skills to gather that information and collate it and then map it in ways that your ordinary person who doesn't understand data could understand, okay, right, where I live, it's going to be okay at 6 o'clock. Or, you know, this looks like it's getting better, the wind's coming in. And they triangulate that with their body. One woman said, we became like salty sailors. We learned about wind direction. No one's ever cared about wind direction before, but you know the wind brings the smoke. So suddenly we care about wind direction. And they love this guy because he, on Facebook and Twitter, like very, you know, socially available technologies, pulled in all this data and made it usable. He stopped doing it after the fires. It's not something that's continued, which I find interesting. But I think this summer we're all waiting for fires to start again. So I think it'll restart. And just quickly, what am I up to time-wise? Yep. So I mentioned before that some of our participants lived on the south coast, where there was, in Canberra, the fire was in the national park, but it didn't threaten houses, many houses. So there was not an evacuation in Canberra. Down the coast, there was endless evacuations. And this is a picture. This is where I go for my holiday every year, one of the most beautiful beaches. There's normally like 10 cars there. This is an evacuation scene. So everyone in the whole little town has been told they have to go to the beach because the fire is coming down the mountain, which you can't even see the mountain because it's so smoky. And people have to gather at the Surf Lifesaving Club or literally on the beach. And some beaches, people had to go into the water. Like that's how close, because the bush goes down to the water. So this is an evacuation photo from one of our participants. And it was black. There's burnt leaves flying in the air. I mean, it's a very scary experience when you're there for hours and hours. They're trying to assemble water and food and work out what to do. So no one at this point is thinking about air quality. That's my point, right? If you think you're going to burn, air quality is the least of your concerns. You're just trying to get away from fire. So these participants, we're like, oh, so we're tracking the air quality? And they're like, sorry, what? No, we were trying to get away. Like, that's not interesting. So it's this really interesting point about how close you are to danger, what matters. Nothing matters except getting out of fire at this point. And Facebook, interestingly, in these, even though Facebook in the city scene was very useful because you could share data, Facebook in this scene becomes quite frightening and alarming because people get scared and they post like crazy on Facebook, and it became very confusing. So several of our participants had ended up evacuating to the wrong place or driving around in sort of 8, 12-hour circles because of information on Facebook which was not right. So they eventually all said, we stopped looking at Facebook, we didn't look at Twitter, we just followed government information because it was so frightening and misleading. And of course the radio becomes very important because electricity goes down, right? And this is just sort of story that I told you at the beginning. So Katya had this newborn baby and she had to evacuate. So they said, we just don't know where this fire's going to go. So they were just getting everyone out of the village. It was thick black smoke by this stage. It was probably about 9 o'clock at night and it was just black. It was crazy. And the smell in the car, you couldn't get it out. We were all wearing like the heavy masks and stuff in the car just so we could have some sort of air. Then I was breathing. I would take my mask off and breathe my air into my baby's lungs just to try and give her some sort of fresh oxygen. And then my partner would do the same thing. I was thinking, okay, it's a bit strange. Looking back on it now, probably wasn't a great idea because we would have had a lot of smoke in our lungs too, but we were just, you know, survival mode. You just try and do what you can. First baby, I don't know, first baby, first bushfires, what do you do? Right? So this kind of really frightening thing about air. So of course, people care less about air quality when they're in fire, but air becomes literally about can you breathe and how are you going to get this baby to breathe. This woman ended up with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the baby's, you know, she describes the baby breathing out black smoke. I mean, I don't know what it actually was, but that was her experience, that she could see smoke coming out the baby's mouth. So just to finish with some conceptual stuff. So here's some conceptual points that we develop in the book. So biomedical and public health uncertainties lead people to act to protect themselves. That's pretty basic, but they do. People will do stuff even though in the face of uncertainty. Often in good ways. I don't think that's necessarily a bad way. And we have some conversation in the book with a senior public health official who said that's exactly what you want people to do. You want people to collaborate, to draw on data, to think for themselves, not just be obedient. But sometimes they take risks they later regret. So people did some crazy stuff, like not going to the evacuation centre because they had a baby and they was worried about the baby crying. You know, like crazy stuff. And citizen science, I think, can be really important to give data. If it's done well, it can be a really, really important thing. Of course, our work shows that bodies and environments are imbricated or interconnected, and breathing makes this really clear. I mean, there's nothing like breathing to show how the world and the body are connected, right? And there's a whole chapter in the book on breathing. Similarly, as I said before, bodies and technologies blur because they both do this work of sensing the environment. So I think we can't make a clear distinction between bodies and technologies. We use our bodies as technologies and technologies as our bodies. It blurs around in a really interesting way. And of course, those of you who work in reproduction, you know, pregnancy is already a blurring of the individuality and the otherness, right? Like, it really brings that up, being pregnant in climate crisis, because is your body a protection or not? People were very confused. Is it better for me to give birth to the baby early and then I can take care of it, or do I want it to stay inside? Most women felt like they wanted it to stay inside. They felt their body and their placenta could somehow protect the baby from this world, from this terrible world. But then the baby had to come at some point. So this fairly interesting thing. And of course, new forms of responsibility and new forms of anticipatory labour unfold in these circumstances, and they will. So there's a geographer called Emma Garnett who writes about air pollution, and she also talks about this blurring. And she talks about the respiratory dynamics of buildings and bodies. I think that's a really interesting phrase, that buildings have a respiratory dynamic. Buildings breathe in smoke, as do bodies. You know, we need to think about our relationship between bodies and buildings. We talked about this a bit on Tuesday, but some of the work we've been really using here is from Michelle Murphy, the anthropologist and STS scholar from Canada. First, she's a Métis scholar, Indigenous scholar, and she talks about, it's pretty obvious really if you're a sociologist and anthropologist, but worth saying, you know, reproduction is uneven. Like, different people have access to different ways of living, different resources, different forms of safety and unsafety. And she talks here about unchosen arrangements, which I think is a really wonderful phrase. How unchosen arrangements affect the embodiments of humans and non-humans. And these can be acts of structural violence that destroy the possibility of future life and produce life unborn. So she talks, as some of you will know very well, about alter life, which is an idea that we shouldn't think about each new life as a sort of pure life or even aim for a pure life, but we should think about life as already made through structural inequalities and through relationship with environments which are often toxic. And they're often toxic for the most disadvantaged people, right? So she says, let's not try and deny that or cover that up or hope for something that is not that, but let's acknowledge it and look at how we can make ways of living with that in a better way and helping people survive and to flourish in very difficult circumstances. So looking at the sort of distribution of suffering. So I guess what we're saying back to Stephen Pine in his concept of the Pyrocene is we need a bit of this in there too. What is the structural inequality? What are the distributions of suffering that occur in the Pyrocene? Because he doesn't really pay attention to that. And we do that, we try and do that in the book. It probably needs more development, but it's a start. Building on this, we try and introduce this idea of pyro-reproduction. So thinking about reproduction in the pyrocene and how might we bring feminist understandings of the unequal distribution of reproduction, reproductive justice, systemic disadvantage into thinking about this much bigger picture about the planet and what the hell is happening with fossil fuels, climate crisis, etc. And that there's a kind of problem of scale here, I guess. We tend to think of reproduction as this small thing and then these massive planetary things, but we need to find a way of getting these things into conversation, which is not just about population. We've got a whole critique of the idea of population. A lot of environmentalists think if we're talking about reproduction, we're talking about overpopulation. We don't want to talk about that very complicated term. We want to think about reproduction, making babies and making kin, making families. And we want to talk about non-humans as well. So going back to all those animals that died, their reproduction has been severely interfered with as well. It's not just humans that matter here. We are in relation to them. And if we learn from First Nations, if we learn anything, we learn that we are country. Country involves animals and plants. Losing trees and losing animals matters a lot to our reproduction and theirs. So it's frightening. Pyro-reproduction is frightening. I'm sorry if it's disturbing to any people. It's not enjoyable. And we're doing new research now. Mary Lou and I are doing new research on young people's feelings about reproduction. Yeah. Because the people in this book are all people with babies. So we asked them, what do you think about climate crisis and having babies? And they're all like, well, maybe I won't have any more, but my baby's going to be a really great environmentalist, an eco-warrior, and they're going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I'm not sure whether you know that, but so then we want to talk to people who haven't got babies. So now we've talked to about 40-something, 25 to 35-year-olds who don't yet have children, asking them the same question. And about 30% of those, both boys, male and female, queer, straight, like all different types of people, say, I'm not having kids. And they put this into climate crisis. They are very highly concerned about what it means to bring a child into this kind of world. And I think this experience of the 2020 fires really made climate crisis feel like it's not in the future, it's right here, right now. And I think that's been a really important thing. So we feel as feminists that we need to think, and sociologists, to understand that and to think about how we're going to reproduce, what reproduction is going to be going forward given this. That's what I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Celia, for the brilliant talk. I think you really bring together several different fields, climate crisis, reproduction, feminist SDS, and environmental studies in a very smart way. I believe our audience must feel very much inspired as I am. So you have controlled the time very well. So we have 30 minutes for discussion.
Yes.
So please raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly and ask the questions. And maybe we can take a question one by one.
Yeah, sure. And
okay.
And comments too. Don't feel like you have to have a question. I'm just interested in responses too. So.
Okay, so maybe you go first.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name is BJ. I'm from the University of Chicago doing an exchange program here at Taida. I'm interested, you talked a bit about, touched on it first with the sense of smoke in India being something that people would be taking as for granted or as an everyday phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then the other example of the woman where she said she felt her baby was breathing out black smoke. I'd be interested if you found or talked with these women since they've had their children about any potential health effects or other cognitive impacts that the exposure to such an extreme climate event had, and if in any way there would be some sense of difference that you'd imagine based off someone, let's say in somewhere like Mumbai or New Delhi, where there's a consistent exposure to high levels of pollution, and if this one sort of cataclysmic event, so to speak, is enough to influence development on the same level of a consistent exposure from a young age to pollution.
Great question. I mean, that is exactly the question that the mother and child 2020, MC 2020, the medical study is trying to address, because no one knows. Like, is it, because I know more about endocrine disruption because I've done research on that. So with endocrine disruption, it does, like, slow on enduring exposure is quite different to a one-off big exposure, and that exposures are very complex things, aren't they? I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but sometimes a small amount of something can be worse than a large amount, or the timing is really important. Like, when in development you're exposed to something can have a big effect. Also with alcohol, isn't it? Fetal alcohol syndrome, they still don't really understand when does it matter not to have alcohol or not. So there's some research on bushfire, exposure to bushfires, that shows that the size of the baby is affected, which is really important. It always sounds like nothing, or the size of the baby, but actually the size of the baby is super important for all sorts of future health things, but also the process of birth itself. And there's some interesting things about sex, like about male and female, that are affected by smoke, which is really interesting. But this is exactly what this study wants to show, and to track these children over 5 years. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to get funding, and it's really frustrating for us because we don't understand why the government doesn't think this is interesting. But I think it's because of this idea that it was just a one-off. So, I mean, it goes back to this idea about how important do you think climate crisis is? And do you think, well, this is just a so-called natural disaster that's not going to happen again? Or do you think this is the new world? And I think, to be totally honest, I feel that the funders, Australian government funding bodies, still think that is just a sort of one-off thing. And I guess we need to wait maybe a little bit longer till people see it as something that is an enduring part of life now, and that we do need to understand what the developmental effects will be. Very much, unfortunately is a ridiculous word to use. I mean, the fact that COVID came straight after this also has huge developmental effects, at least, well, probably. And again, this is being studied all over the world now, doesn't it? Like, because these were babies born, they didn't get to have the sort of social engagement that they would normally have. Often the women had fewer medical appointments, so their prenatal appointments or their early appointments once the baby's born would be the midwife sitting in the car outside talking to you on the phone. Like, she might dash in to take a measurement and dash out. So they didn't get, and so some of our participants who had had the babies by the time we spoke to them felt that conditions had been missed. That there was, in 1 or 2 cases, reasonably serious health conditions that had been missed because the developmental problems, because the babies hadn't been seen often enough. And I mean, I happen to know one of these people, and in our study, and her little kid has had a lot of breathing problems, but again, it's not a big enough, I mean, unless you do that really long-term longitudinal study, we're not going to know whether that's a blip or whether it is actually caused. Of course, there's all these media stories coming out saying, oh yes, these babies are more likely to have asthma. You can see there's a rise in asthma, but that hasn't been properly demonstrated yet. But it's certainly an open question. Yeah.
I'm Li Wen. I'm from TMU. I'm just curious about, because you mentioned about you are conducting the current project about asking if young people would like to have kids in the future. Yeah. And I'm also thinking about the pregnant couple or pregnant woman you interview, because they experience smoking environment during their pregnancy. But after childbirth, I just wonder, did you ask questions like, are you willing to give to have another child after this? Yeah. Did you ask this kind of question? Because I just wonder if they experience this and maybe they don't want to have child, but
yeah, no, we did. So all of these women were interviewed after they'd had the baby, because of how long it took us to get the ethics approval. So we did ask every single one. So what we sort of tried to frame it in the least confronting way, because it's a bit difficult if you're interviewing someone with a baby saying, oh, so do you regret having a baby? I mean, you know, you're not going to ask. So you have to ask that very carefully. What do you think now? What do you think now about, and this was during COVID, which in my mind is also a climate crisis issue. I mean, obviously in a slightly more complicated way. I don't know whether other people see it like that, but so we asked, I can't remember the exact wording, something like, do you have any thoughts about climate crisis and reproduction? I mean, something quite general. But a lot of people said, oh no, I'm stopping now. Like, this is enough, this was terrible. Or their husband might have said that to them. And it had caused some problems with couples, like husbands saying things like, if I'd known this was going to be like this, I wouldn't have done it. And the women saying, but, you know, what do you mean? So it's a very difficult topic for partners. And I think, again, something that people will need to negotiate going forward. And, yeah, people had all sorts of strategies for thinking about, for, you know, sort of retrospectively justifying what they'd done. I mean, we do that all the time as humans, don't we? And as I said, mostly they did that through thinking, my child will be a good child, a good person who will help climate crisis going forward. You know, they had no grounds for believing that, but that was just what they were hoping. I guess everyone hopes their kid's going to turn out to be a good environmentalist, you know. But, yeah, no one said, oh, this has really encouraged me to have children and now I'm going to do it a lot more. I mean, that doesn't make you feel like that, does it? No. Oops.
Thank you very much for the really interesting, inspiring talk. My question is about the variation of social class,
yeah,
or socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
I think at some point in your talk, you mentioned that like poor people, they are getting more smoke and pollution.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is that a geographical reason or there's something else? Obviously, like people access to Dyson will be
Yes.
mediated by
Yes.
social
or
class.
Or plane tickets out.
And also, I think car, right? If the household have multiple cars, that can increase the capacity of mobility.
Yeah.
But what I like to add is, I think there has been literature that talking about how women's understanding and experience of pregnancies vary by social class,
exactly.
right?
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how that can
Yes.
be, I don't know, exacerbated
Yes.
in a time of climate crisis.
Exactly.
Thank you.
That's such a great question. So yes, there's a little bit of work about the way that Canberra works as a geographical city. It's a kind of flattish city, but surrounded by what we call mountains, but they're basically hills. They're very small. So there's been studies that show that smoke collects in particular parts of the city, which are more working class parts of the city. And I don't know why. I mean, did someone know that, or did it just happen? Or I don't know, how do people decide where? I don't understand enough about urban geography to get that. So that's a sort of factual thing. The MC 2020 study is collected a lot of information about where people were during the fires, because people moved quite a lot. Like if they could, they moved. And we'll try and track actual smoke exposure through people's perceptions of it, but also using data, like from those air sensors, to try and see who was more exposed. And they have a much broader range of social class. So people were willing to do the survey, but not to talk to us, which is fair enough. It's a different thing, you know. So there's different migrant groups, there's different ethnicities and age, first pregnancy, you know, there's all sorts of variation amongst those 1,000 women in that study. But I think your other point is really interesting, and we try and write about this, that, I mean, it's so hard to speak about it without sounding like you're just being sort of deterministic around class, but these are women who, as I said, they are intentionally pregnant. They very much value, they didn't get pregnant by accident. They were planned pregnancies, and very, what would you say, subconscious, very aware. So they were people who valued health and believed themselves to be people who could act in the name of the health of future health. And that to me is a class position. That's a class position, right? That you feel you can act to maintain your health because you can pay for alternative health services. I mean, in Australia, you pay for the doctor. You can claim some of that back from the government, but you still pay. very hard to get a free doctor in Canberra. You know, the good midwifery programs tend to have more middle class people on them because you have to know about them to get onto them. You have to turn up early in pregnancy to get onto them. So there's all sorts of really small ways in which class matters, and it's a lot about your ability to sort of find out about stuff and to get yourself on the right list. So there's all that sort of believing in yourself as a health consumer or an active health producer. So I think these are very middle class in that sense. They're reading scientific. These are sort of women that are like me. I mean, they're Googling scientific information. You know, they're not reading what they've read on some, you know, unprofessional site. They're going to Web of Science to read scientific papers. That's the kind of people they are, you know. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And the other thing just to say is housing stock, of course, is really important. So public housing in Canberra, there's a lot of public housing, and I mean, you know, I'm talking about a privileged country, a privileged city in a privileged country, but nonetheless, public housing is more leaky, so the smoke gets in more. Because they're older houses that haven't been so maintained. So, you know, again, really upper middle class people pay money. I'm just having this done in my house now. You can get your house sealed off if you can pay to have an architect come into your house. They can do these evaluations of gaps and sort of science, and they can tell you where you need to pay money to have all that sealed up. I mean, if you don't have money for that, you can't do it. So there's a big push to try and get public housing people to pay attention to this, and we're hoping that's partly what our work will do, to show that people have a right to have a house that is safe, that they can breathe in, and that actually a lot of work needs to be done on cooling houses and making them smoke-free. And the ACT government has just passed legislation, which is really good, and part of what we were lobbying for actually, that there will be public places of refuge in heat and smoke events. So there's always been bushfire places to go, but they're not smoke-free. So they've now got legislation where they can take over clubs, which are like sort of football clubs or like big places, unfortunately, where there's alcohol and gambling, so that's a bit of a problem, but nonetheless, big air-conditioned places, and those places are going to have good smoke insulation and cooling, and people will be allowed to go there for free because they've realised they can't, people have got to have somewhere to go. So that's new. We couldn't, no one would talk to us, honestly. I mean, it was so frustrating. I tried every avenue I could, but people were so stressed. I mean, this was such a, I mean, you all had it too. It was just, people were trying to educate their kids at home. They were off at work, or the working class people having to go to work because they work in service jobs. So we just couldn't get anyone. It was very interesting to me because I think there's always this thing, isn't there, that if you're a sociologist, you're supposed to be talking to working class people. And we had to, at some point, just go, okay, we have to respect this. We've been told no, really clearly. Not going to do it. So, didn't do it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, there's many hands. Let's have a line. Okay, maybe we can ask questions together.
Yeah,
and Ting Shuo, and you, and Shun Nan, and me. That's the end of it, okay?
That's the end of it, yeah, good.
All right,
you have to
Ting
help
Shuo
me
first.
remember.
So I have a quick question.
Yes.
I'm interested in the state role or the state responses in this pyro-reproduction, because you talk about the women use citizen science to collect the data and maybe challenging the scientific agenda as well.
Yep.
But also we know that this kind of challenge will also threat to the or account for the state's solution to it. So I wonder how the state responded to in the era of pyro-reproduction.
Thank you.
So I'm Ellen Cole. I'm an assistant professor of geography at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I'm a Fulbright scholar here this year at NTNU. Really great talk, and so I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to do two, and one actually related to the previous question. Yeah. And the first one is thinking about, from the feminist STS perspective, how knowledge actually did move into these spaces, because there is a lot of well-documented research about PM 2.5's impact, not from fire.
Yes.
And so particularly with cohort studies in the US in the context of how, I mean, and there's a lot of placental, developmental and reproductive work on that. So I was curious about how, if at all, that moved into, kind of the way that people were consuming this knowledge, because there's not the fire knowledge, but there is this really extensive PM 2.5 knowledge. Yeah. And kind of related to that, but also related to the last question, is really thinking about that difference between the individual response versus the collective response. Yeah. And thinking about in the context, particularly in the US, around a lot of the PM 2.5 and the pollution, the solutions are pushed off from the state, from the, the whatever, pyro-reproductive kind of environment, and pushed off onto the individual. And so thinking about how is that kind of integrated and brought into both people's responses, but also how they engaged with the situation.
So when you say, do you mean that it was made individuals' responsibility?
Yeah. So instead, so the individualization of, in the U.S. instead of it being, the polluter's problem, it's like, well, what happens more? Yeah, exactly. So kind of thinking about that in this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Star in Department of Sociology in NTU. So I thank you for your wonderful talk. So I will only have one question now. So because you did all the interviews during COVID, and COVID is actually also a threat through breathing. So I'm wondering, have you have they compared their experiences of dealing with COVID and bushfire, and what are the differences, and how that may shed light on the unique characteristics of bushfire?
Thank you. Great question.
Okay, my question is about the comparative studies of your work with other cases of pregnant women exposed to other kind of risk. Your book reminds me, for example, the radiation mom during the Fukushima disaster in Japan. Yes. So it seems that they have different situations. They need to protect the fetus, and they feel that the body and environment are blurring. But one case in the Fukushima event is that the society feel that the women's bodies are polluted forever, even though everyone is exposed to the risk. But it is women of reproductive age that will give harm to the fetus if they become pregnant in the future. Yeah. So they become stigmatized and they cannot get married. They look bad in the marriage market. Wow. But that might be not the case in this pyro-reproduction. So I wonder, what are the layers of anticipatory labor? Thank you for using that concept. And if we can compare the pyro-reproduction, radiation reproduction, PM 2.5 reproduction, and maybe we can find out the similarities and differences. So we can have this.
That sounds like a good project.
All right, thank you. So that's
I'll just
all
quickly,
the questions.
So it might go backwards because it's fresher in my mind. I mean, I don't know much about that work. That's very interesting. I think the whole thing about nuclear is, of course, that it is the half-life, isn't it? That it is a kind of toxicity that stays forever. And I think, this goes back to the first question about this is seen as a sort of one-off single exposure. So it depends whether you think it's going to be ongoing or not. The paper I gave on Tuesday, I was talking about epigenetics, and there is some research about the epigenetics of smoke and PM 2.5, all that stuff. So air pollution and possibly smoke. And I think that's very new research scientifically. So I think there will be more concern about the way in which these exposures permanently change, or semi-permanently, whatever you call epigenetic effects. They're sort of both semi-permanent and changeable, which is what's so confusing about them. They're intergenerational, and yet you can modify them. So I think there's a sense that they might cause intergenerational harm, but yet that you could do something about it, which makes them both deeply intriguing but also completely overwhelming, because they're terrible, but you should be able to do something. You know, that puts you in a very difficult position, which goes to the question of individuality and collective responsibility. You know, whose responsibility is it to ameliorate the effects, if there are long-term effects of this? Like if these kids do, by the time they're 5, I mean they're 3 now, if they have more asthma, for example, whose responsibility is that? Who's going to do something with those kids? And how was that? Who's going to investigate that? Who's going to think about helping those kids going forward? Who's going to track that into the next generation? There's lots of really interesting questions that open up about responsibility. I guess I liked the citizen science because to me that it was more of a collective response, and women said, I didn't have time to show you all this, but said it felt really good that someone else cared about this besides me. I think these kind of women, they're very individualised kinds of people, and COVID, you know, was like the experience of individualisation and also collectivisation at the same time, wasn't it? It was such a strange experience. For me, it really brought those things up. You were there alone by yourself in your home with your partner and your baby kind of thing, but also you were having to do what everyone else had to do. You had no choice, no freedom. Suddenly we were part of this incredible insistence that you behave like everyone else. So I think the whole idea of the collective and the individual got totally mangled in COVID. And I think bushfires do the same thing. These huge emergencies, you sort of both lose your individuality but also end up, you're so frightened you're fighting for yourself. So I think that's a really interesting, I haven't thought so much about that, but I think it's a really interesting question, what you do. And the state response, there wasn't much really. Like that leaflet was put out by ANU because the state wasn't producing anything. The state is all about getting away from fire and protecting people from burning to death. That's what they care about. There was massive, incredible resources on that, really fantastic information. People loved the national radio. We all had this government app called Fires Near Me, which showed you every fire, the most where exactly it was, and a live update on the state of the fire. So there was all this really important work being done on fires, but practically nothing on smoke, because smoke wasn't seen as important. So I think citizens like this guy, the dude, they fill that gap. And so one of our interviewees was a friend of mine who happened to be in charge of all the public health in Canberra that week. It's a rolling job, and he was like the chief public health officer. He's a clinician, public health clinician. And he did this really great interview, which we talk about in the book. He said, we didn't know. We don't know what it does to babies or pregnant people. So I guess he said, I think it's probably okay. Like the baby is protected by the woman's body, but I don't know. So it's really great. He liked to hear that people were making decisions together. And he said, that's good public health. And I thought that was a very interesting and brave thing to say. And it's quite, he's also got a PhD in Foucauldian sociology, and I think it shows. As he said, my colleagues in public health often like to think they know the truth and we know the science and we can tell people what to do and people should obey. And it's irritating if they don't do it. And he says, I don't believe that. I think, and he's a sort of critical public health, I guess, that information is the best you can get. It's contextual, it's flexible, it changes. And what you ideally want is people to read it, discuss it, and make decisions that are smart, as smart as they can be, and that will work for them. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to say. But of course, sometimes people will end up putting themselves in danger. Doesn't mean it's all going to be great, but that is a really important part of moving. We don't know the answers to these problems yet. So did I answer all the questions? Yeah, I don't think that science about air pollution, I didn't travel very well, I would say. I don't know why, and maybe this is wrong, but people feel like bushfire smoke is really different to factory-produced smoke. And it goes back to that question of who's to blame. There are no well, there are, but we see this, because we frame it as a natural disaster, there's sort of no one to blame. But of course there are, because it's not a natural disaster. But you can't just say that factory should turn its chimney off, or, we should all stop driving more. It's a kind of more complicated thing, I guess, because we're all to blame. So I think there's a really interesting way in which perhaps people wanted to distance themselves from that science because it was rather troubling. And that goes back to the original thing about people would say things like to us, oh, yeah, well, they have that this is in India. You know, like kind of quite racist things really, but so Canberra's not supposed to be like that. Other places have terrible air, we don't. And there's sort of that shock of the loss of the privilege of clean air, I think was a very interesting thing. And I think maybe there's that, well, that science belongs to them, it doesn't belong to us. You know what I mean? I'm making stuff up now, but that's my sort of gut response to that question. Yeah.
We have last 2 minutes.
Oh, right.
Any any questions from our YouTube participants? There are many YouTube participants, right? Right, okay. So next time, come to NTU.
Yeah.
And so we have last one questions. Bingjie.
Oh, great.
Hi, I'm Bingjie from University of Chicago. I kind of building off your answer to all the above comments. I was wondering about the political consequence of such an embodied experience of being polluted and undertaking this reproduction under this extremely polluted circumstances. And what I mean by political consequence is I'm not familiar with kind of the political landscape or of political stances of environmental policies in Australia, but I wonder if people are undergoing this experience of pregnancy and shifting their opinions on environmental policies, both on an individual level and on the collective level, and kind of also go back to the beginning of your talk where you feel like this is framed as a natural disaster, but it really isn't, and it has kind of this like part of the colonial and also we are all to blame kind of this mentality. And I wonder how these white middle-class women who are educated are conceptualizing and internalizing this this kind of paradoxical identity as both the victim and the perpetrator of this violence. Yeah, thank you.
That's such a great question. I mean, it was COVID just changed this so much because it felt like during the fires, it felt like this incredible moment where climate crisis became real, as I said, very immediate, and it felt almost like, oh, okay, now environmental stuff's going to, like environmental politics is going to shift. I mean, Australia has a shocking track record of climate denial, you know, like really bad. I mean, we're internationally renowned for not responding in a good way, which isn't to say that there's not a lot of environmental activism, but certainly the previous government, you know, let's just mine stuff. You know, fossil fuels is where we're heading. But then COVID came and it kind of took the wind out of the sails, you know, because suddenly we had to deal with another problem. So it was a great disappointment for environmental activists because people sort of forgot about it really quickly. And then bizarrely, I mean, luckily really, but we've had the El Nino changed. So we've had 3 cool, wet summers. Right, and this is now, we're heading into the summer. This is the first summer where they're saying, okay, it's going to happen again now, right? And we are looking down the barrel of a gun, like, and there's all this, get your house ready, all this suddenly. But we haven't talked about it since 2020. So there's been this terrible gap. There was this moment, and part of that was recognition of First Nations fire expertise. I mean, you saw First Nations fire experts on TV describing what needed to be done, why, you know, books were being published, popular books, like people started to read about it, educated women, so they would talk to us about, well, you know, this is about Indigenous people and this is about colonisation, like they knew that. So that knowledge sort of had this amazing, I only just moved back to Australia a year before, so it was fascinating. I've been away for 20 years in the UK, then to come back and think, oh my God, there's all this recognition of Indigenous expertise, this is incredible. You know, maybe Australia's finally doing the environmental thing, and then COVID happened and went silent. You know, and it's such a tragedy because that was the moment where something could have changed. So this summer is going to be a very interesting time because if it happens again and nothing's happened or people haven't sorted stuff out, people are going to get really angry. I mean, I think people can't take this again, especially after COVID. So, for example, this legislation in Canberra where they're making these heat refuges available, I had a reporter come to talk to me last week because they're not actually ready yet. And they're like, well, the bushfires can start at any point, so why aren't they ready? You've had 3 years to get this ready. But people were doing other things, weren't they? They were, rightly so, focusing on COVID. So there's a real sense of deja vu, I guess, but really hoping that there will be a change. But Australia is deeply invested in fossil fuels, and even our new, more left-wing government is being severely criticised for still allowing new mines to open, to gas, you know, buying nuclear submarines, etc., etc. So it's still very much on the agenda to try and get environmental issues recognised in the way that they need to be in our continent, but in every other continent, in my opinion, you know. So I think it had a big impact. I think hopefully these women and their beautiful babies will become environmental activists.
Okay, because of time,
Yes.
we have to end our section here now. But Celia has kindly agreed to stay for about another half an hour to talk to people. And we provide some fruit and cookies on the tables. So you feel free to talk to Celia after I formally end the talk. Please join me to thank Celia.
I need to get that received.